Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Devina Wadhwa. She's a psychiatrist, and today's KevinMD article is How Physician Burnout Silently Creeps In and Takes Over. Devina, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's start by briefly sharing your story and journey.
So I'm a psychiatrist and I work up in Northern Ontario in a smaller town called Thunder Bay. I also do a bit of work up in Northern Canada in the Arctic in Nunavut and in some smaller northern communities as well. I was trained previously as a pharmacist at the University of British Columbia, and my journey sort of moved me to Toronto, where I completed a residency in psychiatry and then was very interested in rural psychiatry, essentially in underserviced areas. And that's how I ended up here in Northern Ontario.
So tell me about some of the things that you see in those rural areas, in those indigenous areas from a psychiatry standpoint. What are some typical things that you're seeing?
So, working in a place like Thunder Bay, and we call it underserviced, there is so much mental health need, and oftentimes not enough psychiatrists or mental health clinicians overall. So you end up seeing lots of clients on a day-to-day basis, and you essentially come across individuals that struggle with significant amounts of trauma, and intertwined in that trauma history, comes mental illness, substance use, and then the overarching psychosocial difficulties that a lot of individuals struggle with: homelessness and living in low socioeconomic statuses. I think it's very similar in many parts of the country, but really the more rural you are, the more people struggle to get services that they need, and they often wait a lot longer, than they should.
You wrote the KevinMD article, How Physician Burnout Silently Creeps In and Takes Over. Before talking about that article itself, what led you to write this one in the first place?
I had a good, I call it, a dose of burnout that really sort of changed and shifted my perspective and crept in probably 2 years ago in my own life. And coming out of that, I have really reflected on just creating some more awareness in a very vocal way around how it's a real thing. And, we use this word a lot, and that's where the article sort of struck me is I hear burnout all over the place: burnout, burnout, burnout. And actually stopping to think about what it feels like was quite profound for me. And I struggled with this sort of sense of hopelessness around the work, this sense of not achieving and making a difference in the world. That's what I set out to do in
Hmm.
medicine and in mental health. And that's sort of the inspiration of the article, and wanting to write and share with clinicians, with learners. I teach a lot of medical students and residents through the NOSM University, and I'm quite open about my own journey and my struggles. And I find it delayers a layer of shame that we all have as clinicians, where we need to kind of push and work hard and almost feel like nothing affects us. And really, burnout's real.
So tell us your story. Tell us about some of the challenges that you faced.
So, I think as a new grad, I'm 7 years into practice now. My first, I'd say, 5 years, I was very keen to sort of help,
Hmm.
for lack of a more sophisticated way of describing it. And I think the last few years, that feeling started to degrade a lot more. I felt like I wasn't making a difference. I felt really bad about myself, about my work. I didn't feel fulfilled. I didn't feel like I was helping anybody. It started to creep into my home life, where I was more irritable in my home life. My partner was the first person that picked it up, being like, "Do you think work's really affecting you?" And my first defensive answer was like, "No, I'm fine. Everything's good. I'm
Hmm.
fine." And I think just really reflecting, going back into psychotherapy for myself. I had a psychotherapy course in residency for myself, was really eye-opening, because I thought as a staff clinician, you're immune to anything sort of difficult happening, because that's what you trained for, and you can do anything that is put in front of you. And I really realized quickly that actually I couldn't, and I was more anxious. I was doubting myself. When a bad outcome would happen, I would berate myself about it. I lost quite a bit of confidence as a clinician. And just stopping and thinking about, okay, what can I do differently? I know I love the work, but I need to love it in a different way, working less, becoming a little bit more creative in what I did and mixing my work up. So not just acute care psychiatry and emergency room psychiatry, but this mindfulness piece has sort of started to become part of my toolbox. Teaching has been really important for me. Wellness has been really important. So I've started to branch out a little bit. And in my article, I do mention, right, what does get sacrificed is, you think about, okay, how much in terms of remuneration gets affected when you work a job that maybe provides more remuneration than others. And it's a sacrifice, and it's a real one that sometimes is taboo to talk about. And at the same time, I think my health and my wellness and my outlook on the work as a clinician has improved significantly. So I think for me, that sacrifice and the compromise has been well worth it.
So what kind of changes specifically did you make? Did you work less? You said that you worked in other settings. So tell me the specific changes that you made.
So definitely, from sort of this intensive environment of working in an acute care setting, I halved the time that I was doing that. So instead of working in a setting like this for 10 months, I scaled back to working in a setting like this just for 6 months. Started to travel a bit more. I started to also engage as a speaker in continuing medical education conferences away. So there was a bit of travel and sort of psychiatry teaching with that, teaching more yoga, teaching more mindfulness courses has been part of that. And then sort of working in even more rural areas has somehow become part of the mix of the work, which actually feels really fulfilling, but I'm not doing it all the time. So, a bit of play, much more play in a way, but still lots of work, but just a good mix of work for me. And honestly, talking about the struggles with burnout and, to jump with moral distress where you sometimes feel like it's you as the clinician, but our system, our healthcare system in general, I'll talk about the province of Ontario, there's a lot of pressures from
Mhm.
all directions. And, I think as clinicians, we do feel that, and that can aggravate that sense of hopelessness and helplessness we feel towards not being able to do the best that we can for our patients sometimes.
So just to be clear that this was intentional on your part in order to address some of the burnout symptoms that you're feeling. The job itself, did they make any accommodations in terms of helping and addressing your burnout at the job?
So, in terms of the actual job, being able to work less, I would say that was an accommodation where it was like, I can't do this all the time. So, this is what I can do, and I will do it well if I'm able to do it this way. So, that was an accommodation, right?
Mhm.
Because scaling back is always challenging for a team that's already quite strapped from a human resource perspective. But the environment per se and the system per se, I think that's where a lot of us clinicians are trying to navigate around. There's not enough family doctors out there, right? There's just not enough. Hallway medicine is becoming sort of routine standard now, and those are the things I think we need top level changes, but right, I don't know what it's going to take to change at a system level so clinicians on the ground like myself are able to work in more conducive settings.
Talk more about what you mean by hallway medicine.
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, and transparently, I have not worked in Southern Ontario since I finished my residency, but I know when I started in Northern Ontario, there was spaces to see patients. Patients would get into rooms in 24 hours. And now, we see patients in emergency room hallways waiting for bed for 3, 4 days. And, you're trying to squeeze and find a little private corner to speak to your patient. And being mindful, these are patients that are suffering from emotional distress and mental illness, and there's no space. And it's a constant sort of negotiation about needing to have people discharged, right? And hallway medicine is really, there's so much need, and our infrastructure feels like, not to be pessimistic, but it's crumbling to a certain
Mhm.
extent at some moments to be able to serve the needs of our patients and do the job well that we were trained to do.
So in your case, you cut down your work schedule and you're able to pursue passion sometimes outside of medicine. So talk to me about a commentary in terms of our healthcare system. So one implication is that it is very difficult for physicians to practice full time. I'm a primary care physician. I do internal medicine, and I'm half time as well. And I'm seeing that it's very difficult for physicians to practice a full time patient care load. Is that what you're seeing as well? Physicians who do practice full time, they're going to be more prone, of course, to burnout.
100%. And I'm a prime example of that. I set out when I graduated to, want to be a clinician, teacher, educator, researcher. And I think that's where I reflected, and those were the biggest feelings I struggled with at failure, being like, my goodness, I can't let alone do clinical work full time. How am I going to try and achieve all these other hats? Because we're always sort of told or subtly trained that these are the things we need to do in order to become a successful physician. But I see a lot of clinicians around me that, not are choosing not to do full-time work because it's just not sustainable and it's just not possible. And we're seeing, I know in psychiatry, a lot more new grads that are coming out and becoming locum physicians and are managing to sustain practices as locum doctors, because a lot of us that set out to work full time are not able to do that anymore.
So how long did it take you to accept that hey, you couldn't practice in your ideal way because it was burning you out? Was that difficult to accept? And if so, how long did it take you to come to terms with that?
I'd say 2 years. And I reflect back now, and my article highlights how it slowly engulfs you. And it took me a while because there was this sense of, that's not possible. I cannot burn out. That's just not possible. I do all the right checkbox things for wellness. And and then that acceptance happened and this new liberation and freedom came with it. And now I don't feel ashamed to share. And even with my junior colleagues, it's an open dialogue about, it's okay not to be able to practice at a certain intensity for a long time. It does not mean that we're not good or we're failures in the clinical sense.
So are you starting to see that trend shift? Are you seeing some of your colleagues come to terms with a less than full schedule in order to prevent burnout?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, is it a good thing for medicine? I think about me and, our future generation where we have a lot of us working less. I don't know the answer to that. And yet I think it's a good thing that we're able to check ourselves. And when we're at work, we're good and 100% well, emotionally, physically, mentally. And so that's a good thing. We just may need to train more physicians to be able to accommodate for the need that our society has.
So you mentioned that you have medical students and you have resident interns sometimes rotate with you. So given your own experience with burnout, what kind of things are you advising these future physicians?
So it's interesting. So at NOSM, the psychiatry rotation, medical students actually come in their fourth year. They're a little bit different from other schools, and by that time they've already sort of made their choices as to where they're essentially headed. And it's always like, in medical school and residency, we are waiting. It's this delayed gratification for when I'm a staff, I'm going to have a balanced life. It's coming. And, it doesn't matter now. I'm going to work, I'm going to do 1 and 4. It doesn't matter. But when I'm a staff, I'm going to be a balanced physician. And we graduate and we actually realize we don't have the tools to know what balance is, because our entire decade we've spent completely living lives where we're not balanced. So I think it's always a reminder, look after yourself. And it's the checkboxy stuff. So for example, when I start a call shift, I'll say, make sure you take 30 minutes an hour, go do a wellness thing, and then we're going to meet and divide our night and do call together, right? So these little subtle things I think really matter, because they're our next generation that's going to do the same for the next generation. And I'm not saying that patients should wait 5 hours longer because the clinician needs to go and practice yoga, right? But the clinician needs to be well and 100% ready to be a complete listener for them. So it's this fine balance we strike around looking after our patients, but being well ourselves to do it well.
We're talking to Devina Wadhwa. She's a psychiatrist, and today's KevinMD article is How Physician Burnout Silently Creeps In and Takes Over. Devina, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
Thank you. I would say look after yourself, because that's how we can then look after each other. And then that moves on to looking after our patients or our clients. And medicine is such a beautiful profession where we learn how to look after others at the cost of sometimes looking after ourselves. So look after yourself.
Davina, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.